Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Global. We'll get you the top stories from India and the region. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh, and for news from rest of the world, I'm joined by my colleague Benji Hire in Washington, D.C. Good to see you, Benji.
Yes, good morning from Washington, where we'll bring you the latest in US-Israel ties amid major political developments in the Middle East. Plus, efforts to end the war in Ukraine stall. All that coming up after these headlines. Back to you.
Ukraine peace summit in Switzerland concludes with limited gains. Kremlin highlights futility of talks without Russia. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu denounces tactical pauses announced by the army in Gaza fighting, also dissolves his war cabinet. US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan meets his Indian counterpart Ajit Doval and External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar in New Delhi. Focus on bilateral, regional and global issues. First up, news from Russia. The Kremlin has said on Monday that Swiss conference on Ukraine crisis had negligible results and showed the futility of holding talks without Russia. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said the results of the meeting were close to zero. He further added that Russia remains open to dialogue with all countries that intend to conduct it. It also said that conference provided Ukraine with a chance to showcase the support from Western allies. And DD India correspondent Dasha Chernyshova joins us live from Moscow with more. Dasha, Russia has downplayed the outcome of Ukraine peace summit but expresses openness for dialogue. What are the possibilities of real talks ahead?
Well, interestingly, Moscow says it is still open for the negotiations, but it says again that the conditions that President Vladimir Putin has most recently outlined are still there and Ukraine has to take them. That is to withdraw troops from the 4 regions that Russia now claims as its own. Then immediately Moscow will be ready to cease fire and get to the negotiating table. So any conference where the participation of Russia does seem to require this issue. Having said that, we've heard the Kremlin on Sunday also saying that Ukraine should understand that every time that Moscow makes a peace offer, or at least an initiative to bring this conflict back to the political and diplomatic track of solution, the conditions for Ukraine on the ground are getting worse and worse. Until now, Moscow has been saying that any talks should take into account the realities on the ground, but now Moscow wants the Ukrainian troops out from the entire territories of those 4 regions, which Russia doesn't have full control of and is still fighting for. So the understanding here in Moscow is very clear that the world majority and the countries that took part in this peace conference in Switzerland, they also took the note of Russia's absence and the meaningless of any discussions on the Ukrainian settlement without Moscow participation.
And amidst the tit-for-tat peace proposals and peace summit, what is the latest on the fighting on the ground?
Well, we understand that Moscow will continue fighting until the negotiated solution is possible. The Russian troops are expected to continue the work on the Kharkiv direction, where Moscow is creating the so-called sanitary or buffer zone. We've heard the Russian Ministry of Defense saying that over the course of the past hours, the operational and tactical aviation, as well as unmanned aerial vehicles and artillery, have managed to strike the Ukraine Ukrainian military as well as the Ukrainian military equipment supplied from the West in 110 regions of the country. And also very important nominations are still being made at the Russian Ministry of Defense. The Russian president has just dismissed several deputy ministers of defense, replacing them with 3 new who will be responsible for the upgrade of the Russian Ministry of Defense after the Minister of Defense has been replaced himself. He is now the veteran economist Andrei Belousov, so his new team is expected to further increase Russia's military spending and to increase the efficiency of the Russian military.
Dasha, thank you for those updates. And let's look at the developments in the West regarding the Ukraine Peace Summit. Joining me is Benji Hire from Washington, D.C. for more on this and other stories making headlines around the world. Benji, it seems the much-touted Peace Summit made limited gains.
Yeah, Western powers denouncing Russia's invasion of Ukraine at a summit in Switzerland on Sunday, but failing to persuade major non-aligned states to join in their final statements. More than 90 countries participated in these talks over 2 days. Moscow, as we've been hearing, was not invited, and China's decision to abstain ultimately meant the summit failed to achieve Ukraine's goal of convincing key countries of the global south to join in isolating Russia. We hope to have more reaction on this story from our correspondent in Europe shortly. Now to Israel, where Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his army continue to spar over its strategy for Gaza. Mr. Netanyahu has denounced the IDF's plan to hold daily pauses in fighting along one of the main corridors into the Palestinian Strip in order to facilitate aid delivery. He called that daily 11-hour humanitarian pause, quote, unacceptable. He's also dissolved his war cabinet in past hours after former General Benny Gantz quit the government, accusing his boss Netanyahu of having no effective post-conflict plan. Meanwhile, Israel has accused the United Nations of not doing enough to ensure aid delivery into Gaza. Trucks carrying humanitarian aid were seen at the Gaza border a day or so after Israeli military announced these tactical pauses in fighting.
We've only seen around 25 additional trucks make their way into the Gaza Strip since the beginning of the war, and there is a serious need for additional number of trucks, and we have worked together with the UN to increase that. But unfortunately, the UN isn't doing enough right now.
As the crisis in Gaza continues, we've seen clashes across the Israel-Lebanon border, now threatening to spiral into a wider war as near-daily exchanges of fire between Israeli forces and the Hezbollah militia escalate. A dense cloud of smoke was seen rising over the hilly frontier in southern Lebanon on Sunday. Last week, Hezbollah launched rockets and drone attacks against Israel. Hezbollah says it will not halt fire unless Israel stops its military offensive on Gaza. An Israeli military official said Israel will take necessary measures to protect its civilians until security along the country's northern border with Lebanon is restored. Well, an advisor to US President Joe Biden is currently en route to Israel for meetings, an attempt to avoid further escalation along the blue line between Israel and Lebanon. Elsewhere, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has been raising concerns over human rights in China, the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and the Indo-Pacific region, all in a meeting with Chinese Premier Li Qiang in Canberra. The case of China-born Australian writer Yang Hengjun, who was handed a suspended death sentence by a Beijing court, was also raised during that meeting. The visit by Li marks a thaw in ties between the two nations after tensions erupted over Beijing blocking $20 billion in Australian exports and friction over defence encounters. Polls in the UK are painting a grim picture for Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and his beleaguered Conservative Party. They predict a wipeout for the British government, the governing party of the Tories. One pollster warned of an election extinction in the an electoral extinction, I should say, in the election which is scheduled for July 4th. Mr. Sunak's leadership has been racked with difficulties. He's not been able to win back much public support during this campaign that he called by surprise weeks ago. One poll by the Sunday Times projects the Conservatives could end up with just 72 seats in the 650-member House of Commons. That's the lowest in their nearly 200-year history, while Labour, currently the opposition, it says, would win a massive 456 seats. Lastly from us, stateside, US Special Forces and South Korean forces conducted a combined live fire exercise on Monday at a shooting range in South Korea's Taebaek city. During the drill, an AC-130J Ghost Rider aircraft was seen hitting targets on a mountain. The South Korean and American militaries have boosted training exercises in response to North Korea's weapon testing, including ballistic missile launches and tactical weapons firing. Well, we were speaking earlier about the peace summit taking place in Switzerland over the weekend. We were hearing about the nations which didn't attend. For more on this, we're joined by Trent Murray, our Europe correspondent in Berlin. Trent, good to have you with us. Just talk us through who did actually turn up and what some of the key developments were from that summit.
I mean, yeah, that's right. I mean, we've obviously been hearing, haven't we, Benji, some criticism from Moscow that this summit wasn't really representative of the kind of broader push for peace, given that it wasn't in attendance. But what we do know was that 100 delegations did actually attend, including some 57 heads of state. And you might imagine at first glance that it was largely made up of Western countries, European ones, and you would be right in assuming that. But there were some other surprising nations there. Saudi Arabia, for example, Chile in South America, we know Kenya, Albania, Jordan, Serbia, Singapore. So it was a broad mix. And we know that the final communique didn't necessarily get all of them to agree to sign on. But what we do know was that there were some breakthroughs on key issues like food security, nuclear safety, as well as a desired push to get towards peace eventually. I think Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, probably summed things up best when she said peace in Ukraine is not going to be achieved just in one step. It's going to be a journey, and patience and determination is required. And I think for President Zelensky, that is why this summit was so crucial, to have a broad mix of countries there in the room to try and chart his course and chart his country's course rather for the future. Of course, it is not easy. We know the front lines in this war have barely changed since 2022. Tens of thousands do continue to die. And so that is why you are seeing, I think, a concerted push both from him and his allies to try and find some sort of settlement. But what they won't do is give in to what he describes as Russia's desire for capitulation in Ukraine and for taking territory that they've already claimed. For Zelensky, that is a red line. And so it feels in many ways the peace negotiations may just have to go on for some time.
Trent, thank you. Thank you for keeping us up to date with developments. Trent Murray in Berlin, keeping track of that conflict still erupting across the European continent. That's it from me here in Washington. Back to you in the studio in New Delhi.
Thank you, Benji. Have a good day. And still to come on DD India Global. Allied forces showcase strength in the disputed South China Sea. Passenger train hit by goods train in India's West Bengal.
Complex issues, hidden agendas, twists and turns, strategic games. We think all dots are linked. We just need to connect them. Join me every week as I connect the dots to unravel hidden designs in statecraft, mysteries, and decode issues that matter to you. Watch Connecting the Dots with me at these times on DD India.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Global. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. Allied forces showcase strength in the disputed South China Sea as the United States, Canada, Japan and Philippines conduct a two-day joint maritime exercise. The maritime cooperative activity involves a series of maritime maneuvers to test and validate the interoperability of armed forces, doctrines, tactics, techniques and procedures. Earlier in April, Philippines conducted joint maritime activity with Japan, Australia and the United States. Philippines has turned to countries supportive of its claims in the South China Sea to counter what it regards as increasing aggressiveness of China. A broad range of bilateral, regional and global issues were discussed as Indian External Affairs Minister held talks with US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in New Delhi on Monday. Dr. Jaishankar said he was confident India-US strategic partnership will continue to advance strongly under Modi 3.0 government. This is the first trip to India by a senior American official after NDA government led by Prime Minister Modi returned to power. Earlier, the US NSA met his Indian counterpart Ajit Doval. The duo reviewed progress on the India-US initiative on critical and emerging technologies. Sullivan is also expected to call on Prime Minister Modi. And the latest update, US National Security Advisor also met India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Taking to social media platform X, Prime Minister said, India is committed to further strengthen their comprehensive global strategic partnership for global good. DD India correspondent Meghna Dev joins us live with more updates on the story. Meghna, take us through the key takeaways of Jake Sullivan's India visit and engagements. He also just met the Prime Minister.
Yes, Shubhendu, as you said, he just met the Prime Minister. US National Security Advisor did call on Prime Minister Narendra Modi. And importantly, obviously, when he met the leader, he did discuss on the bilateral cooperation that both the countries have, especially ISET. Because ISET is one of the aspects which is, which has picked up momentum when we're talking about critical and emerging technologies. And during this meeting as well, Prime Minister Narendra Modi did recall the interaction he recently had with US President Joe Biden on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. So definitely a lot in terms of cooperation between India and US when we are also talking about the second meeting of the India-US initiative on critical and emerging technologies. Now, what are we making out of this initiative and discussing more? Today, the meeting also discussed more on strengthening the cooperation in this area. By ISET, we can definitely figure out that there are talks on semiconductors. There is talk on the space sector. There is talk about the biotechnology sector. Also, when we're talking about clean energy, we're talking about quantum. We're also talking about defense, defense and other sectors. Very importantly, few important aspects, if I can,
yes,
for our viewers, if I can explain. Very importantly, there was an industry roundtable as well where NSA Ajit Doval and the US NSA did meet the industry experts, CEOs. They also did. We also understand that Jake Sullivan is accompanied by a high-level delegation, which also has industry experts for that matter. Very importantly, a combined over $90 million will be unlocked by both the governments for the India-US Global Challenges Institute. Now, this institute, is in the pipeline in terms of the MOU that was signed between the Association of American Universities and IIT Council.
Okay.
So it is a very important aspect. Now, besides that, also when we are talking about other aspects that were discussed, defense is one sector that was definitely discussed in the terms of India's planned acquisition of MQ-9B platforms. Obviously, co-production initiatives were discussed when we are talking about defense co-production. Now, very importantly, we know that India and US also have cooperation in the tech sector, not only just bilaterally, but also under the Quad. We are also talking about the other multilateral grouping like the India ROK, which is the Republic of Korea, and US technological trilateral dialogue.
Okay.
So these are important, platforms, or we can say multilateral platforms where India and US are collaborating in terms of tech and ICT. So having said that, telecommunications is also one important sector which has been discussed in terms of the task force which is currently doing R&D on the 5G and 6G, We are also talking about clean energy initiatives. Besides that, also we are talking about the pharma sector where APIs have been discussed. So we can probably see the brief that we get about today's the second ISET meeting. We definitely have a host of different issues that were discussed and which are especially in terms of semiconductors as well, because bringing in more countries, bringing companies to India to actually utilize the ecosystem that India has in terms of semiconductors is one of the important aspects that India is trying to pursue for that matter. Also, startups were discussed. When we are talking about regulatory framework or regulatory issues that startups face to enter either countries, be it the US or India, that was also discussed. So comprehensively, a lot was discussed in terms of under the ISET initiative.
Right, it's gamut of issues in focus as Sheikh Sullivan meets the leadership in India. Thank you, Meghna, for those updates. At least 9 people were killed, over a dozen injured in a train accident when a passenger train, Kanchenjunga Express, was hit by a goods train at Darjeeling in India's eastern state of West Bengal. Kanchenjunga Express, which links the northeastern Indian states of Assam and Tripura with West Bengal, was hit by a goods train. All necessary measures were taken to ensure evacuation of all injured at the earliest. India's Railway Minister Ashwini Vaishnaw visited the incident site. He also announced an enhanced ex gratia compensation to victims, 1 million in case of deaths, 250,000 towards grievously injured, and 50,000 for minor injuries. On the other hand, in the first high-level US-India dialogue post-India's parliamentary election, US-India Strategic Partnership Forum will hold its 7th annual leadership summit in Washington on Monday evening. This annual leadership summit is the most prestigious US-India gathering in Washington, D.C., bringing together a distinguished cohort of eminent individuals and key stakeholders from both the countries. The summit will focus on critical and emerging technology initiatives and honoring Henry R. Kravis for his contributions in strengthening the bond between United States and India. And now all the updates on the 18th edition of Mumbai International Film Festival. On the third day of the 18th edition of Mumbai International Film Festival, a session with veteran filmmaker T.S. Nagabharana explored the transformative potential of documentaries and how they bring issues to light, ignite action and shape a better world. The session, moderated by D. Ramakrishnan, GM NFDC, talked about using documentary films to promote social transformation.
The great filmmaker T.S. Nagabharana is with us. He was here for a session where he spoke about how documentaries socially impact our society. Sir, I'll start with that question itself. To what extent, the documentaries are impacting our society, and the fact that, it's not very easily accessible, the documentaries. How do you think it can make a change?
No, I will tell my experience in that. I will go back to my childhood. Whenever my father used to take me to a film, before the film starts, I used to see a film division documentary. There was no news during that time, there was no television or anything like that. So whatever I wanted to know, I used to know through that film division documentary, which is before the film. And I would love that more than the film. This is how my association with short films. But when I started making films, and especially at the age of 18, I was so fascinated with a camera, and that too with still cameras. So that's what I did. Later on, when I became a filmmaker, I realized that unless and otherwise, if you can speak with images and communicate to that whoever who wants to reach that, his memory will be very strong. The imaginary, especially photographic memory, is there in each and every person. So his memory will last for a longer period, and that's where our films makes a sense. Documentaries, short films, that will make a sense and it will change the society.
Eid al-Azha festivities in Indonesia witnessed with people offering prayers at mosques and sacrificing livestock. A ritual prayer, Salah, was held by people making sacrifices. Eid is also known as Festival of Sacrifices and a major holiday in the Islamic calendar. The festival will be celebrated until Tuesday in the country. That's all for this edition of DD India Global. Let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. For those on the go, you can get all the latest news and updates from India and across the world on DD India mobile app. The app is available on both Android and iOS platforms. Scan this QR code on your screens to download now. We'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh from all of us here in Delhi. Thanks for watching DD India Global. Namaskar.